Hi, my name is Cupin, and you are watching Rappler. I am in Jakarta, Indonesia, for the 43rd ASEAN Summit. President Marcos is here alongside other ASEAN leaders to attend the summit and other related summits. We'll be talking about that much later. This is the second summit of Indonesia's hosting of or chairmanship of the ASEAN. If you recall, if you care enough about regional summits and geopolitics to be brushed up on these things. Earlier in May 2023, ASEAN leaders converged in Labuan Bajo in Indonesia, that's an island in Indonesia, for the 42nd ASEAN Summit. Ano yung difference ng 42nd sa 43rd? To begin with, uh, clearly the venue is much different, but the summit here in Jakarta is much bigger than the earlier one. So, nung first summit, you only had the ASEAN leaders converging in Indonesia. This time, you have all ASEAN leaders, or at least representatives of each ASEAN member state, but also dialogue partners of ASEAN. Sino yung dialogue partners? We have countries like the United States, South Korea, Japan, China, India, among others. So they are also here. Some of the leaders of those countries have actually already arrived in Indonesia ahead of the related summit. Yun yung part that is actually referring to the related summit. So what is the focus of the 43rd rather ASEAN Summit? First, you have trade in the context of a post-COVID-19 world. Actually, itong post-COVID-19 na discussed na to during the previous ASEAN summits in Phnom Penh and Cambodia naman, specifically in the context of President Marcos's participation in the ASEAN summit this time. He wants to push forward things like the digital economy, the rights of migrant workers, and climate change mitigation, among others. So this is really the bloc, the ASEAN bloc, the region, helping each other or finding ways to help each other as we push forward in a world after years of lockdown due to COVID-19. Now, connected to trade actually is discussions on regional security. So let's listen to a clip of Indonesian President Joko Widodo speaking earlier during the opening of the 43rd ASEAN Summit.
ASEAN, as a large ship, also has a major responsibility towards the hundreds of millions of people who are sailing together on it. And despite having to sail through a storm, we as ASEAN leaders must ensure that this ship can continue to sail and that we have to be captains of our own ship to achieve peace, to achieve stability, to achieve prosperity together. And with this, I declare the 43rd ASEAN plenary session open.
Now, what are the security concerns that Jokowi or Joko Widodo is talking about? He didn't spell them out, but let me do that for you. Top of mind, of course, is Myanmar. Myanmar is, of course, a member of ASEAN. But in the last ASEAN summit, yung statement or yung consensus ng leaders was to call out the junta. Myanmar is currently ruled by a junta for not complying with the five-point consensus na draft ng ASEAN or ginawa ng ASEAN, in-approve ng ASEAN, including Myanmar earlier on. That's going to be also, speaking of the five-point consensus, we expect discussions on that. Perhaps that it's time for ASEAN, or you would expect ASEAN leaders to review whether Myanmar has complied with the the five-point consensus a year after calling junta leaders out for non-compliance. Another, of course, is tensions over or in the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan is independently governed, it's democratically ruled, but China has always claimed it as its own, and that has led to tensions in the region that's not in the Southeast Asian region, but it's close to Southeast Asia, thereby affecting countries in Southeast Asia. You have also, of course, Russia's unending war on Ukraine. Beyond security issues, you also have issues of trade and the economy. If you recall, Russia pulled out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and that has affected not just Ukraine, but countries that are dependent on the crucial grains supplies that whose parang distribution in the world has continued because of that initiative. But because Russia has pulled out, parang na-compromise yung supply chains ng very crucial products na iyon. Also, top of mind discussions during the ASEAN Summit is the issue of security in the South China Sea, security and stability in the South China Sea. If you are again familiar with discussions in ASEAN, 10 years ago, nagsimula yung negotiations for a code of conduct on the South China Sea between ASEAN and China. 1 decade later, wala pa ring code of conduct, but discussions are ongoing. In fact, Manila was host to another discussion on that just a month or two ago, a month ago, a few weeks ago. But also yung context nito, no, parang China's growing acts of aggression in the South China Sea for the Philippine-specific case in the West Philippine Sea, or the part of the South China Sea that's within Philippine territory or the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. If you recall, earlier in August, Chinese ships, Coast Guard, and maritime militia tried to block, actually the first go, they successfully blocked half of a resupply mission to Ayungin Shoal, specifically to BRP Sierra Madre, the Philippine outpost in Ayungin Shoal in the West Philippine Sea. Another resupply mission was done later in the month that was successful, but again, the Philippines issued a diplomatic protest against China over that incident. Um, Also, just last week, China released its 2023 standard map that featured a 10 dash line. Previously, it was a 9 dash line, claiming most of the South China Sea. That, of course, that line has been deemed uh, illegal or not proper by an arbitral court arbitral tribunal rather. That's a 2016 arbitral award, but China has refused to acknowledge that ruling. And the 2023 standard map actually expands on that 9 dash line, naging 10 dash line na siya, to include Taiwan in as their kumbaga expressed supposed territory. Now, another issue there also affecting the Indo-Pacific actually is beyond the 10 dash line. That 2023 standard map is in which China claims territory that's part of India, also including disputed land between China and India as its own. Now, India has filed a diplomatic protest over that. Malaysia has filed a diplomatic protest over that map, and the Philippines actually earlier filed a diplomatic protest over the 10 dash line, and it expressed its rejection of the 2023 standard map days after it was released to the public. Now, yung overarching theme din sa mga tensions na yun is the growing competition between the United States and China. Now, why is ASEAN in this mix? Well, flashpoint ng tensions na yun, yung Southeast Asian region, of course, the South China Sea, you have the Taiwan Strait, and this is also an example of middle powers. So yung push ng Indonesia in the 43rd ASEAN Summit is a show of middle powers trying to assert itself amid the growing competition between the United States and China. They're saying that if we band together, or the idea is, if you band together, then you become less vulnerable to being affected by the competition between these two superpowers. Now, going back to President Widodo's statement earlier, no, another thing also that Indonesia rather is pushing in the context of uh, pushing for security and stability in the Indo-Pacific. They have pioneered the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Summit. So the idea here is for the ASEAN to be the leader, if not a major voice, in promoting security in the Indo-Pacific. Now, security kasi it doesn't just concern talk of defense, talk of militaries or coast guards. Defense has to do, or security rather, has to do with economic stability, making sure that you are uh, shielded or not left vulnerable from the whims of externalities, not just to a country, but to a bloc. So that's what you're pushing for in saying that you want stability in the region. Now, going back to what President Widodo was talking about earlier, he spoke of ASEAN as sailing together through a storm, but he also added that it's important for us, referring to the bloc, of course, to be captains of our own ship. Again, an allusion to not being forced to pick sides in that superpower competition, but it also brings up the question of ASEAN as a bloc of 10 uh, countries with its own interests, with its own national interests, with its own set of allies. So yung parating tanong sa ASEAN is, isang tenet kasi nito ay consensus. So kumbaga, if one ASEAN country disagrees with the stand, wala na yun. It's rejected outright. So hindi pwedeng half lang, hindi pwedeng 9 out of 10 lang. Kailangan 10 out of 10. So that's also been a point of criticism of ASEAN na parang dahil sa need for consensus constantly, allegedly or apparently, ASEAN sometimes becomes unable to move on pertinent matters. That's been a sharp criticism of the bloc. So the question here is, in this vision, in this goal of ASEAN as the center of security and stability in the Indo-Pacific, can the bloc find consensus in order to reach that goal? So in the coming days, you'll have summits. You have the East Asia Summit, that's ASEAN plus several other countries in the region. You have the ASEAN plus 3 summit, that's ASEAN, Japan, South Korea rather, and China. And you have, of course, the ASEAN US and then the ASEAN China summits, among other summits. Maraming summits na sunod-sunod mangyayari over the next 2 days. Another thing, President Marcos announced during the opening plenary session earlier that the Philippines will be hosting or has accepted chairmanship of ASEAN in 2026. That's a year earlier than originally scheduled or intended. We were supposed to host in 2027, but we will be moving up, kumbaga, because Myanmar, in effect, waived its slot or its turn to be ASEAN chairman again because of the instability in the area and also amid concerns of human rights, the human rights situation in Myanmar. So again, this has been Bea Cupin. You have been watching Rappler. Keep it here because we do have a live blog a live updates page where we post updates from Jakarta, Indonesia, as well as videos, clips, not just of President Marcos, but of other ASEAN leaders, their interventions or their speeches and their positions made during the ASEAN Summit. Again, this has been Bea Cupin. Thank you for watching Rappler. Terima kasih. Bye-bye.